Okay, for those of you who've just joined us as well, welcome to the Cropping Decisions in a Risky Environment, our second webinar as part of the RiskWise program. I can see a few people joining. Great to have you here. We'll get started just a couple of minutes past. We'll let a few more people arrive and then we will get going. For those joining, just letting you know, I've put a comment into the chat. Please ensure that you're on mute. You can keep your cameras off if you like. We will start recording in a moment, and any questions will come through the chat. And I've also been collecting your registration questions as well. So, all right, I'm going to hit record now, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. Okay. We might get started with some of the housekeeping and I'll let people into the meeting room as they arrive. There we go, a few more coming on in, which is great. Okay, so everyone, thank you for joining us today. This is the second webinar that we're running as part of our Cropping Decisions in a Risky Environment decision-making series. Today, we're really thrilled to be offering our second webinar, and it's in response to a lot of questions that we've been getting from around South Australia and the southern grain growing region. So a bit about the day. This workshop will involve a series of quick update presentations followed by a Q&A session. I'm very pleased to welcome our four speakers here with us today, who I'll introduce as they speak, but I'll get Peter to start. Give us a wave, Peter, from the SA Drought Hub. He's the Deputy Director and works with SARDI's Climate Applications team. We have Sam Trengove here from Trengove Consulting. G'day, Sam. Emily Chambers here from Pinion Advisory and Barry Mudge from Barry Mudge Consulting. And my name's Belinda Kay. I'm with Ag Communicators and I'm helping run the webinar today. So thrilled to have you all here today. Thank you for joining. A bit about the day. So, as you know, many are now finishing seeding following one of one of the best starts we've had in many years, with strong opening rains, good stored subsoil moisture, and follow-up rain. The challenge is now deciding how aggressively to chase yield potential while managing the risk of a potential dry finish and high input costs. I'll just let some more people in. Some of the challenges with decision making currently include high fertiliser costs and uncertainty around supply, potential for an El Nino event resulting in a dry winter followed by a hot spring and summer, risk of not applying N and leaving yield on the table. And so this second webinar will address some of the current thinking around early and mid-season N applications. What are the likely benefits and how can farmers capture better returns on investment in N applications? Our speakers are going to reflect on how the season has progressed since the first webinar we held, which was about a month ago, and address how seasonal conditions are playing out in respect to in-season N decision making. So today, I just would like to give a shout out to the RiskWise team who are supporting this webinar. So for those who are unaware, the RiskWise program is a national risk initiative and it seeks to understand and improve the risk reward outcomes for Australian grain growers by supporting grower on-farm decision making. It's a Grains Research and Development Corporation initiative, and they've invested 30 million to support this 5-year national initiative, which runs from 2023 to 2028. So a big thank you to GRDC for their support. And you'll notice we are part of the South Australian Central Action Research Group. And I'd like to give a shout out to the HART team, Mid-North High Rainfall Zone, Murray Plains Farmers, NSS, Upper North Farming Systems, Pinion Advisory, the SA Drought Hub, Barry Mudge Consulting, PIRSA SARDI, Trengove Consulting and AgriLink Consultants, who are all part of that South Australian Central Action Research Group. So as you can see, RiskWise is a national initiative which is covering all grain growing regions throughout Australia. And as I mentioned, we're part of this Central South Australian Action Research Group, which is led by the Hart Field Site Group. And you can see that area in green that this central group covers. So we've got lots of information coming out, and following this workshop, we'll send you some more information to keep you up to date. So I can see lots of people have joined our meeting so far, and I'd like to offer you a big welcome for joining us. Some housekeeping. Please keep your sound on muted today so we don't get any background noise. Please place any questions that you have into the chat. So it should be down the bottom bar of your Teams platform, and I'll be monitoring the chat throughout. We will attempt to answer them in the Q&A, but we might not be able to address all of them. The questions we'll be focusing on are around the decisions for this year, and we've had a lot submitted through the registration process. So I've got a heap of them ready to go, and hopefully that helps answer your questions. We'll also be issuing a paper and summary document after the day, which will have links to further information and resources that we'll share with you all. And just a note that we are recording today's session so that it can become part of the RiskWise resources. So note that we've put the spotlight on the speakers. So the video recording should focus on them and our shared screen, but we invite you to keep your cameras off if you're more comfortable with this. And again, please keep yourselves on mute so we don't have any background noise. So thank you very much and welcome. And also just a friendly reminder that we will be discussing a number of different things today, but always make sure that you seek your own advice and make sure it's relevant to your own farming organisation. Okay, so there's my housekeeping up front. Again, great to have you all with us today. And I think now, without further ado, let's get into the content for the day. So our first session to set the scene is going to be with Peter Heyman. So for those who haven't met Peter before, he's actually the Deputy Director of the SA Drought Hub, and his work includes leading SARDI's Climate Applications Program. He works doing a lot of two-way communication between farmers, science, and contributing to various research projects. With this program, he's actually a lead with RiskWise and helps with the project leadership and supporting the action research groups. So Peter, I'm going to hand over to you and set the scene for us. Where are we now? What's happening?
Thanks, Belinda. And this is a really easy and sort of happy task to do this. So this is my one slide, and I'll do this really quickly. So basically, just stating the obvious is, as you've already said, it's been a really good start. And so there's that February to May. These are the deciles. And so there's areas there that have had the highest on record, and many areas are in deciles 8, 9, and 10 for many people. For that's February to May. And then in the June to yesterday, you can see the millimeters of rainfall there, and it's kept raining for June. The maps down the bottom there, again with the same deciles. You can see that February, the March. So a lot of that rain fell on the very last day of February and early March. Then April was drier, but then May, obviously it's mixed, but we had some wetter conditions through some areas for May. So that's just and these, obviously it's wet. The advantage of deciles is they tell us that this is at the edge of our experience. This is some of the wettest conditions and some of the best start. Not unprecedented, but really quite dramatic in that sense. So I'll hand back, Melinda, but that's just setting that we have these good long-term records, and for as long as the records, this is one of the best starts to the season we've had.
Excellent. Thanks for setting the scene for us, Peter. Okay, to keep going, as I mentioned, we're starting off with these 4 update presentations to set the scene, have a look at where we are at this point in the season. And I'd now like to pass over to Sam Trengove from Trengove Consulting. So Sam is an agronomist consultant based at Butte. He's involved in research and one-on-one consulting throughout the southern region of Australia. Sam's also involved with RiskWise through the NSS group, who conduct local trials, and it's linked with Essential ARG. And I should just say as well, as our speakers are introduced, we have decided to keep our intro bios relatively short today, just so we get more questions and answers in the end, and we can provide more comprehensive bios on our speakers if you'd like as well. So without further ado, Sam, it's over to you, please.
Thanks, Bill. And so I'm going to talk about some of the deep soil nitrogen test results that we've got from clients for this year and how that relates to what we've observed over a period of 20 odd years that we've been collecting these. But before I jump into that, I guess just to reiterate what Peter was just talking about, I've got a soil moisture probe at our place that I monitor quite closely, and it's been in place since 2010. Goes down to a metre, and the sensor at a metre has just started to spike, indicating that the moisture has reached that depth. And we haven't actually seen it reach that depth since January of 2017, I think it was. So it's nearly 10 years since we've had moisture that deep in the profile for that soil type at Butte. So it's quite exciting. Now, in terms of what I'm going to talk about with my slides here, I just wanted to summarise what we found with our deep soil N measurements this year. So what that table there is showing is what the average soil N is in paddocks this year, depending on what the paddock use was in 2025. So for paddocks that were wheat in 2025, our average deep soil N this year is 86 kilos of N per hectare. But there's a wide range that sits around that average. So when we look at the variability across paddocks, the range goes from 27 kilos of N up to 222 kilos of N per hectare, depending on the soil type, location, and things like that. And you can see the results there for the other crop types as well. Canola is about 83, and then the legumes tend to be quite a bit higher, with lentils actually in this year topping the average with 130 kilos of available N. But again, you can see there's a massive range around that, quite often related to soil type, where the lentils range from 34 kilos of N per hectare up to 360. So, and you can see how many paddocks go into those numbers on the right-hand side. So some of those numbers have quite a few paddocks that sit behind it to give us those values. So how does that relate to what we've seen historically? What I've graphed here is how our deep soil N values have varied from season to season since as far back as 2004. And you can see that they jump around a fair bit from one year to the next. And a lot of that is explainable due to environmental conditions and the seasons that were experienced during those times. So what we tend to find is that when we've had good summer rainfall and through the autumn period, prior to the point that we're doing our deep soil N measurements, that our deep soil N values will tend to be higher through increased mineralisation. Other things that will also cause that variability are how the previous crop performed. So whether they were high or low yielding crops, how much fertiliser was applied to those crops that might be carrying through to the following season. So if we look at 2026 on the right-hand side there, we can see that our wheat in the blue is sort of out of 23 years of measurements there. It's the sixth highest that we've had over those 23 years. For lentils and peas, it's the second highest that we've had in that time frame. The number of paddocks we've been measuring for peas has been steadily declining over those years, and the number of paddocks we've been measuring for lentils has rapidly increased with the adoption of those different crops. So you can see the lentil line only goes back to about 2011, but now it's the by paddock number, it's the biggest number of paddocks that we measure in our data. So the highest values there go back to 2007, which was 2006 was a really dry year, and then we had quite a wet period after harvest leading into the 2007 season. So we got some really high numbers in 2007. Likewise in 2016 into 2017, a wet summer, and this year similar sort of conditions leading to some quite high deep soil end numbers. Historically, the graph at the bottom I find interesting is the difference between how much deep soil end we've measured on our legume stubbles versus our wheat stubbles. So on average this year, we're measuring about 37 kilos of N per hectare more in our legume stubbles than in our wheat stubbles. And that moves around as well. And what we find is that is closely related to the rainfall that we've had prior to testing as well. So the more rainfall we have over the summer period, if you flick to that next graph, Bill, the bigger the difference becomes between different cropping histories. So on our legume stubbles where we have more organic N to mineralise, we get high mineralisation, and the gap separates between what we measured on our legume stubbles versus our cereal stubbles, which gives us something to think about in terms of, okay, what was our crop history leading into this year? What might that mean for deep soil land in paddocks that we haven't tested, for example, and what that difference might look like. The final thing I wanted to just touch on is the impact of soil type. We know that sandy soils typically have less available N. Flick to the next slide, Bill. It's compared to our loams, and in a lot of paddocks we will basically do targeted soil samples to the two predominant soil types within a paddock, just to try and gauge those differences. And I'll put this screenshot of the NSS area in the slide here, because you can just make out in that image that the sand dunes and the dune swale type system that exists in that environment. It's pretty easy to identify the main soil types there. Typically, our loams always have higher available N, irrespective of crop type that we're sort of following. But this year, the gap between those soil types is bigger than what we normally see. So normally it's between 30 and 40 kilos of N difference between those soil types. This year it's over 60 kilos of N. And so the motivation there to look after those soil types with lower soil N should be increased, given that they still have relatively low values, even though across the whole data set I showed that the values are quite high. The sands are still hanging quite low, and we'll need feeding to target some higher yield potentials, or even an average yield potential in a year like this. Whereas the loams and the heavier soil types with those higher numbers, in a lot of cases, will have enough N there to satisfy the needs of an average crop. And I guess how much N needs to be applied to those will depend on where the yield target sort of sits, depending on how the season unfolds. So that's me for now, Belle, and I'll take questions later.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Sam. Okay, we'll keep things going with our snapshot presentations, and I'd like to hand over now to Emily Chambers from Pinion Advisory. So Emily is an agribusiness consultant for Pinion Advisory within the Ag Production and Adoption team. She is focused on technical agronomy for broad acre cropping farms, with an interest in farm business management tools to increase value for clients. She's also linked with the Murray Plain Farmers RiskWise group. So Emily today will be looking at cropping decisions in a risky environment, considering the nitrogen fertiliser economics. So Emily, it's over to you, please.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Bill. And probably to reinforce, I guess, some of Sam's point, across our soil testing data that's come back this year, which most of it was sampled after that March rain, they have come back a lot higher compared to previous years. So it's probably, I guess we're focusing on, at the moment, some of the information that we do know before we're making these decisions. It feels like with nitrogen, there's a lot of unknown stuff of what's spring gonna eventuate and look like. But when we're going over the numbers that we do know, it's a good starting point to look at those deep ends. And I'm now switching the focus to our return on investment of nitrogen. So something else that we can crunch the numbers on and at least know what we're dealing with going forward. So, probably the key update, I think, since our last April webinar is that the urea price has generally probably backed off a little bit compared to what it was at that time. I've said as a rough estimate, back in April, we were probably talking $1,400, probably more talking around 1,200 now. It might vary a bit across the state. Do your own numbers, I'd encourage you to do, but that's the number I'll be using today as a bit of a rough guide. So, I've done up here a bit of a sensitivity table to show how that return on investment changes according to urea price and APW wheat price. At the moment where we're sitting, it has ticked up a bit, the return on investment that we've got. It's ticked back up to $3 per every dollar that you invest in nitrogen, which is a little bit more favorable than what we were looking in April. Still not as high as what we'd looked at in previous years, where it might be sort of around the $4 mark. But it probably the key message is if you've got a nitrogen responsive crop, it is still a positive return on investment when you're putting money into urea, which is a key point I think to come out of this. And I'd encourage you crunch your own numbers and calculate it based off of the urea prices that you've been getting and knowing going forward what that is. And probably just a comment, although I've looked at urea, I've heard of a lot of SOA going out recently and people that were able to get that at a pretty competitive price, like return investment was probably even a bit better at the points that they were securing this SOA than what it was for urea, and a little bit easier probably to get their hands on. So probably a note as well that there's a lot of different products I reckon going out this year, just depending on what people were able to get nitrogen wise. And just, yeah, do the numbers and figure out what's going to be the best for your situation on farm. If we go over to the next slide, this one was looking at just wheat. I want to look a bit into the different crop types. So when we're, I guess, thinking of prioritizing crops and where we're going to get the best bang for buck, where we spend our nitrogen, there definitely is some differences amongst the crop types, depending on the grain price that we're sort of anticipating, which is all a bit rough, but I've put some numbers in there to use as a rough guide, and they're different nitrogen requirements to get an additional ton of grain per hectare. So at the moment, based on the prices that we've got in there, non-GM canola is sitting at the highest at the moment. So for every unit, I guess, of nitrogen that you put in, you're getting the best return on it from non-GM canola, just as a result of the price, really. Like the price of that non-GM canola is I guess a lot stronger than what it is sort of comparatively for the other crop types. So if you're looking to be prioritizing, that non-GM canola is a good place to start, and GM canola is not far behind. It's just got that slight price discount, which knocks it back a little bit, but those two are still a strongest, I guess, return on investment. Durum might be a bit unique for people. Not all might have durum, but if you do have that in the mix, that's also a higher return on investment than your wheats and barleys. Once again, just really the nature of, I guess, the price difference. It does require a bit more nitrogen, but the additional price gain makes it sort of worth it. Probably the more interesting one, and applicable to probably everyone in this central action research group, is between wheat and barley. So grain price is the main thing here, that when there's not a large difference between the price of APW and the price of barley, the return on investment of nitrogen is higher for barley. So it uses just marginally less nitrogen, has a bit less price, but overall it stacks up to be a bit better than the wheat. So I guess the way that we'd use these numbers going forward, if you're having to prioritize where you're putting your nitrogen, if you've had tight supply or even just timeliness sometimes, these are sort of the way you'd think about it, of where we're prioritizing putting that nitrogen out there. So hopefully those numbers provide a bit of a starting point, but always would encourage people to, put numbers in that you reckon would apply to your business. That just summarizes, I think, the main sort of prioritization. So probably the key thing, the key caveat to all of that is whether the crop is nitrogen responsive. So all of those numbers only really apply if nitrogen, I guess, is the limiting factor at that point of time that you're making the decision. It won't so much apply if the crop isn't responsive to nitrogen. So probably the key thing that everyone would want to know is my crop nitrogen responsive? And the way that I'd probably think about that is to first just calculate your Fed 2 yield. So think about nitrogen supply to date, and that's where Sam's information about deep end results comes into. And I think that that's some really key information. You probably haven't tested every paddock on farm, but it provides a good probably trend of where we're sitting and some assumptions that we can put in when we're calculating nitrogen budgets. Fertilizer N at seeding or even any to date. I think people have probably already been out putting fertilizer and mineralization as well that you might want to account for. And then we sort of divide it all by the crop nitrogen requirements to figure out where we're actually sitting at the moment with all the nitrogen that the crop has available to date. The next thing that I'd be looking to figure out, which is probably the big question, is defining your target yield, which is probably a bit harder. And I think that some of the seasonal things that Peter and Barry will talk about will help this a little bit more. But stored soil moisture is probably where I'd start. And we're in a really good point, I guess, this year where we have a bit more stored soil moisture than what we usually have. And it's really valuable, I think, to consider that. So, probably among our client base, we've even been thinking of about 25% of your summer rain as being available soil moisture. And probably for that March rainfall, we're even probably bumping it up to counting about 50% of that rainfall as being available for the crop now. Just the way I guess it happened with big downpours at once, probably not as likely that topsoil was drying out as it might in little short bursts of summer rain. It was a fair amount of rain in March and the soil profile stayed wet. So we've probably bumped it up a little bit of what we think for that. And then I guess you'd take into account your forecast for the rest of winter and spring, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more. And I think the real key RiskWise message is thinking about yield probabilities, that it's a range of outcomes that could happen. I think that there's a bit of a trap just thinking of one yield target in your head, when in reality, we don't actually know what spring's going to be. It's a range of probabilities at this point. So considering, I guess, a range of yield outcomes. So with that information, you can sort of then gauge if you're already fed to your target yield, probably not jumping to do anything at this point. If you're well overfed and you're above that target yield, also not really jumping to do anything quite yet. But the key thing is if that fed to yield is below the target yield you have in mind, that's when it's time to calculate the amount of nitrogen that you'd need to reach an economic target yield, which I think the economic part has a lot more focus this year when fertilizer prices have been higher of what exactly is that economic target yield. But I think that we'll probably talk a bit more about that as we address some questions later on. Flicking to some of just the key messages, I think that there is, as much as fertilizer prices have been higher, there still is a positive return for spreading that nitrogen fertilizer out on responsive crop types. That's probably the important bit. If your supply is tight and you might need to be looking at strategic rationing, there's a few differences, I guess, in the return on investment among different crop types. So looking towards them to make that decision. But really, ultimately, the nitrogen budgeting process is the same this year as it is any other year. It's just the numbers that we put into it and the assumptions that we have are just different to the last few years. And probably the point that we're sitting at now and the information that we know as we're sitting here right now is that stored soil moisture and the rainfall that we've had to date. That's probably the key difference that we've got compared to the last couple of years, I guess. So making sure, I guess, that our mindset is in this year, not the last couple of years, but that ultimately the budgeting is still the same process. So yeah, I'd encourage everyone to crunch your own numbers. There's plenty of tools out there. We've got Yield Profit Lite, Barry and Peter's nitrogen app. Consult your agronomist or consultant, and I'm sure that they'll have a nitrogen budgeting type spreadsheet. And just the numbers, I think, put a lot more like credibility, I guess, around a decision that could otherwise be guided a lot by gut feel. So that's probably the key point that I'd want to get across.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emily, for those insights, and we'll come with some more questions for you later on. Thank you. Oh, you're getting a clap. Thanks, Katie. And there's Emily's contact details should you like to follow up with Emily afterwards. Our next session we're going to move on to is with Barry Mudge from Barry Mudge Consulting. So Barry has been directly involved in both practical and technical delivery for agricultural services over the past 30 years. He's part of a family farming property and he's part of the project leadership team with RiskWise. He helps with not only the leadership, but he supports the action research groups. Barry brings a strong practical agricultural economics focus to delivery outcomes at a farmer level. So Barry, we are going to hand over to you for your update. Talk us through. We look forward to it.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Bill. And that talk from Sam and particularly Emily is just a great lead into what I'll be talking about. So essentially, I'm going to talk about a couple of tools that I've been using on our farm this year to try to get a bit of a handle on this decision challenge, very much from a farmer perspective. I'm not an agronomist, but this has already been said. But we've had this fantastic start. Certainly the same at home. We're almost a sort of an early snapshot of what I think is happening across the state. In that our crops are in very early. We're sowing in April, and fantastic yield potential. But the two big questions that we've had is we talk about yield potential, but how do we assess yield potential? So we're going to show you a little tool that I've been using there, and also then how do we sort of come to grips with this high urea price and perhaps a wheat price that isn't quite as good as we'd like to see it, and of course this the concern potentially about spring. So I'll just move to the first tool that I've been using, and both of these tools I'm going to talk about have come out of Sardi Climate Applications, Peter's group. And so Peter's had a lot to do with the development of these. I think a lot of us tend to use water use efficiency as some sort of a calculator to work out, sort of where potential yield sits. This spreadsheet it's available by contacting Peter or Dane at Climate Applications. And Peter, I just confirm with you that if people just send you an email, they will be able to access that tool.
Yeah, sure, Barry. Yeah, thanks. Yes, that's true. And it's also just to reinforce the point that there are other tools that do something similar. I mean, Climate and Yield Profit Light and Yield Profit itself. But we're happy to share this and with anybody who wants to contact us.
Okay. I'll just show a couple of screenshots about how I've been using the tool. So the first thing here that what we sort of plug in is the location. In this case, I'm using Port Germain. The first thing is we try to establish what the opening position is wherever we are. In this case, I'm talking the 12th of June, but we had a fantastic February and March. So I reckon we started the year with about 65 millimetres of opening soil water. We've had about 100 millimetres of rain since in April, May, up to date in June. So we sum those together. That's our moisture available up to date. And what the spreadsheet allows us to do is put in whatever dates we like. In this case, the 12th of June. I've shut it off at the 20th of September. I think our crops were very early district. Will be finished by around then. So what the spreadsheet does is it looks at daily rainfall for the last 126 years and comes up with some decile ranges. And then if we apply some water use efficiency parameters to that, and I've used 100 for the water use efficiency intercept and a slope of 22. So they're reasonably, not conservative, but they're reasonable numbers. The spreadsheet then comes up with a range of yields. And this makes my heart gladden, if you like. The decile 1 potential yield of 2.8 tonne per hectare is just sort of almost unheard of in our environment. 3.7 at decile 5 tonne at decile 9. So you can adjust any of those things, but I look at that and I say, yeah, that survives the laugh test for me. We've got such fantastic potential depending on where spring sits. So if we move to the next thing, so I just encourage people, if they want to use that app, just contact Peter. Not app, that they use that spreadsheet, just contact Peter and he can send a copy. The next thing I've been using is this N app. Again, it's been developed by Sardi Climate Applications in conjunction with the RiskWise program. And it's really the simplified process to look at the upside and downside of post-seeding nitrogen applications. And as Emily talked about, the fundamental, I guess, expectation behind nitrogen application in spring is that it is a risky decision. We apply nitrogen, we get a very good spring, everything's wonderful, and we'll look back on that and say that's a fantastic decision. If we apply nitrogen, we get a poor spring, then perhaps there's a bit of regret there. So there's a classic uncertainty of outcome associated with applying nitrogen, which is essentially that risky decision. And all this app does is try to put some numbers on that, some simple numbers on that, using the 40 kilogram rule of nitrogen. And it's largely based on the fact that the uncertainty is associated with uncertainty about rainfall in spring, not necessarily fully, but certainly uncertainty about rainfall in spring. So if we go to the next slide, Bill, you can access that app. Now there's a QR code there. You can access the app. There's a simple, basically it's just a web page. So there's a simple sort of formula there to get to the web page. We've also done, Peter and I have done a YouTube on the interactiveness of the app. So, and it's not an app as such. We're calling it an app, but it's not an app as such. It's just a web page. So if you can look at that YouTube and get a bit more background to it. So we'll go on. I'll just show a few screenshots of what shows up. Essentially, what we do to set it up, we input what we expect water limited yield to be across the various deciles. And in this case, I've put in those same numbers that came out of that previous water use efficiency calculator, but you can use whatever numbers you think is appropriate for your situation. And obviously this will vary depending on soil water, depending on how much rain you had yesterday and the day before and whatever, the various other things. So that's the water limited yield that you put in across those deciles. You put a bit of other information in this case, the opening soil N and some of that, that's a combination of what you believe the opening soil N might have been, the stuff that Sam talked about, plus any soil, any nitrogen that's been applied up to date in the program opening. You might have done some existing spreading or whatever. I've just used 110. You can put whatever you like. These are sliders. These just change depending on what you want to put in. Mineralization gets allowed for, and in this case, I've said, right, let's aim for a decile 7. How much nitrogen do we need? And essentially that graph above there, which essentially is just yield graphed against a very dry spring 0 to a very wet spring 100. The green line is the water limited line. The blue line is the nitrogen limited line without fertilizer applied. If we apply that 30 kilograms of nitrogen, we come up to that purple line. So essentially that's just stating this really obvious thing that water limited line isn't the same as nitrogen limited. Nitrogen limited is something different to that, but we can push nitrogen limited line up towards water limited depending on how we want to go. So that's fine, but so often we don't necessarily stop at that, but that's just the biophysical component of it. And what we really want to do with this discussion is push that into an economic consideration. So if we go to the next slide, Bill, and what we've done now is we've put in some economics to build over the top of that biophysical. So in this case, we'll put wheat at 320. I've used urea at 1400. I agree, Emily, that should have been lower than that, but that doesn't matter. You put whatever number you want to put in there. We've put a number in there for urea carryover for next year. So we're going to value that in due course because we do all expect that if we don't use the urea this year, then if we're going to put cereal back on there again next year, some expectation of there's going to be some of that urea will be left behind. So I've put a number in there for carryover of urea and the cost of applying the N. And if you look at that curve on the right, that becomes the profit curve, if you like. It's just a partial gross margin of applying nitrogen to this particular crop. So on the y-axis, we've got profit, which is just simply the extra yield being generated by the nitrogen being applied, minus the cost of applying the nitrogen, the cost of the urea plus the application costs. And of course, on the x-axis, you've got really dry spring 0 up to a really wet spring 100. And so the difference between what sits above the line and what sits below the line essentially is the balance of the upside and the downside. And visually, you can see that the area above that line is bigger than the area below. So if you take an average of that, it works out to be about $25 a hectare by applying 30 kilograms of nitrogen in that situation. So all it's giving us a picture. I describe this as the edge. There's an edge in applying nitrogen. Can't guarantee that we're not going to hit the lower end of those deciles, but there certainly is an edge in applying that. Now, if we go to the next slide, what we can do then is look at let's add some extra value of carrying that nitrogen over. So if we have no carryover of nitrogen, that's the same graph as the previous one. But if we value that nitrogen that might be carried over, and in this case, I've put the slider at 50%. If we think 50% of the nitrogen that isn't used, particularly in a drier spring, isn't used, let's put some value on that. And so you can see that the average, the size of the big versus the little, if you like, the upside versus the downside has improved. And in this case, that we put a number on that. It's gone from $25 a hectare without any carryover to $39 a hectare if there is some carryover. So it's just a way of thinking about the value of that carryover of nitrogen. And if we go to the next slide, and I'm going to stop very shortly talking about this, but this is to try to account for some increased probability of a different spring that might be regarded as historic. So the graph on the left, again, is the same graph as we looked at before, where we had with 50% carryover N, a reasonable advantage in applying that 30 kilograms of N. On the right, but that's based on an even bet, if you like, between upside and downside of a spring rainfall. So a 50% chance of above or below median rainfall. If we take notice of the El Nino forecasts and various other things, and we increase that to perhaps there's a probability up to 65% in this case of below median rainfall, what does that do to the economics of applying nitrogen? And it simply has changed the upside and the downside significantly. So if we didn't allow for any carryover, the numbers show that essentially it's an even bet whether we get a gain or a loss out of applying that nitrogen because of the increased chance of a drier spring. If we allow for carryover, there's still an advantage in doing so. So the beauty of this thing is it's just about scenario analysis, and it's all done on a mobile phone. I use it, basically I can see the situation where you're just sitting in the paddock. You might be trying to adjust some of your urea levels and just bang a few numbers into the phone, change a few things here and there, and see what drops out as a bit of an idea of just putting some numbers on this really interesting decision question that we face. So I think what we're going to do now, there's another sort of way that you can access there, and it's in the chat. I see Rachel's put some information in the chat about how you access this. I think now, Bill, we're going to swing to Peter and actually talk a little bit more about this. Whether we are going to get a drier or is the probability of an increased dryness in spring likely?
Perfect. Peter, it's over to you. What can we look forward to?
Okay, so let's start this discussion about the rest of the season with what we know. What we do know is we've had a fantastic start. We've got good stored soil water, and that's really important because we've got enough stored soil water to carry us through. So this conversation would be completely different if we were in one of these terrible years with a really bad start or even an average start. But because we've had such a good start, that's what we know. So always put more emphasis on what we know than on the forecast. And I guess the question is, we've got those series of maps along the bottom there. What's the color going to be for the ones in the future? And I don't know. And I guess my point is that nobody knows. And in that little app, just as you can use your finger and see, I want to look at 50% carryover or 10% carryover or 70% carryover, in the same, you have to make the call. In the same way, you can start with 50-50, 50% chance of dry spring, 50% chance of above average spring. That's actually a forecast in a way. We all have to make a judgment. And I guess I'm saying maybe we increase the chance of a dry spring a bit, but we still have a spread of outcomes. As Emily was saying, we've got that sort of spread of outcomes. Just the next slide, please. So I think because the American National Meteorological Office knew this webinar was happening, they got their act together and declared an El Nino last night. So there's all this discussion about, will we have an El Nino, won't we? And who's doing that? I think Japan beat them. The Japanese Met Office beat them. But basically, certainly in my feed, whenever I try and Google something, because I guess I'm have a sad life where I look at this stuff too much, I've got lots of I get all this information on El Nino all the time. So, and I imagine everybody is aware of this, but so we'll go to the next slide. So this was just downloaded yesterday. Then this is the slide that shows, this is from the Bureau of Meteorology, and we'll give you the links of where to get this information. So if you do want to keep following this, I will say later that maybe you need to be careful about spending too much time following all this stuff. But this is El Nino, this is Nino 3.4, and this is this part of the ocean and the temperature there. And you can see that as of June the 7th, we reached 0.81 degrees. The American value is 0.5 of a degree, what they use to declare an El Nino. But in all cases, you want that line, you see how that line bounces around a bit. You want it to stay above that value for months to be really sure we have an El Nino. So they're just looking at that line. The red is when it goes above 0.8, and that's for the Bureau of Meteorology where we have an El Nino. So July 2023, you can see there that was an El Nino event. All the models, almost all the models, so like all the models are saying we're going to keep warming. Some are saying we'll be warming a lot. So just looking at that axis of temperature there, once it goes above 0.2, 2 degrees, then people will start talking about strong El Ninos, super El Ninos, Godzilla El Ninos, and whatever else you want to call them. I guess an important point there is to, what I understand from the climate scientists is that in Australia, the strength of the El Nino doesn't have as big an impact as exactly where the warming is. So there've been some very strong El Ninos which haven't had the impact as others. So if you would find most climate scientists would be betting that line would keep going north. The question is how far north. The other point is, even compared to 2023, it's going into that fairly early on. So it's giving us some confidence in that. Next slide, please. And then again, just for people who spend too much time looking at this stuff, the SOI has gone very negative. You can see, so the SOI has dived into very negative territory, and the Indian Ocean Dipole, which is very important for us in South Australia, it has actually surprisingly bounced into slightly positive territory, but most bets are it's going to head north from there, either into neutral or into what's a positive IOD, which would increase our situation. So there's 2023, which was a strongly positive IOD and an El Nino for the July to October for 2023. Next slide, please. And so here's just looking at some strong El Nino events. So 82 was a very strong El Nino event. Interestingly, I mean, at that time, there was very little discussion about El Nino just some oceanographers were talking about it. Certainly the agricultural community wasn't aware of it then. it was probably the one that really raised some of that discussion. And then the next strong El Nino was 1997, which was sort of a super El Nino, etc., and it had very little effect on South Australia. And so that's a really good reminder of that. And there's 2023, but 2023 was a year where 2022 was such a good year, and many people were carried through in and did better there in some situations. Next slide, please. So there's this local climate tool, which I think is a great little tool that we developed with the GODC project led by our friends in Ag Victoria, and we were involved, and Federation University did this nice exercise of being able to produce this clickable map where you can look at what El Nino and La Nina does, and also IOD does for different periods and so on. I was surprised when we did this at just how consistent the swing is in El Nino there. So just be careful about the idea of El Nino works better in this part of the world than that part of the world, this part of the state than that part of the state, and so on. It is true as you go to Eyre Peninsula, IOD probably has a bigger effect, but you can see there pretty consistently that the chance of being in the bottom third of years increases, the chance of having the driest third of springs increases. However, there is still some blue there and there's still some yellow there. So there's still a chance of this not happening. And that chance is reasonably high of going beyond the bottom third. So we're changing the odds, but it's not a guarantee. Next slide, please. And then my colleague Dane did this for looking at WA and into New South Wales. I guess my simple point here for people in South Australia is the swings here are pretty big, as well as elsewhere and so on. Next slide, please. So what the Bureau is very clear about is they are strongly of the view that they would rather you look at their forecast than have too much discussion about El Nino, and I think they have good reason for that. The forecast is a supercomputer which is modeling for and taking account of what's happening with the IOD, what's happening with El Nino, but also everything else as well. So it's not just a spreadsheet where you're putting all these numbers in and getting an outcome. It's actually running what's a sort of coarse weather model into the future and giving us this information. So there's June to August, July to September. This is sort of looking at a pretty brown map. And so there's the July to September outlook, which is consistent with what with El Nino. And the Bureau's model has been suggesting we will go into an El Nino quite strongly. Next slide, please. What's really important, and there's one thing I want to really stress, is that little magnifying glass that I put that red circle around is worth doing. So this is looking, so what that does is that will come up and you can enter Brinkworth or any location. Now, when you look at the bottom there, it's a pretty brown map, but this is important because what this shows you is the spread of the model runs. And I think when you look at those brown maps, it looks like it's got to be dry or it's got to be decile 3 or below. Whereas actually you can see there's a spread of model runs. If we were to have the dotted line is giving the 20% chance of being in each of those sets of deciles. And this is showing that we've got a slightly increased chance of drier. However, it's showing that there's still a spread. There's still coherent possible futures where we do get the fronts come across and we get a decile 9 and 10 finish. Everybody will be happy with that, including be able to say that the Bureau got it wrong. What we're saying here is saying that we're actually showing there's a spread of outcomes. Some of the Bureau's models have entered in their good ones. So what we're really reporting here is the spread of what's happened, or what the models are doing for that location. And it says, I think the maps, and just looking at the maps and just hearing the headlines and following some social media can be misleading. It's well worth looking at this to see the spread of outcomes. We're showing increased chance of drier, but that's all we're showing. Copernicus, and we're going, well, this includes a whole series of models, and you can look at them individually or together, and you can see that those models are also showing a general sense towards a drier, but it's not a guarantee. It's this 30%, this sort of of exceeding the median. So 70% of drier, 30 wetter. And in this case, 70% of the model runs drier, 30 wetter when you run many models from many sites. As you look at, so just going back to that again quickly, sorry, as you look at that, you can see that that's got a classic El Nino sort of pattern of wetter over in the Pacific there, and then but just to the north of us, much drier. Argument is that the when you're on the equator, you have the strength of the El Nino has more effect. How it affects our teleconnections down to where we are is much more complicated, and there's more uncertain because there are so many other factors and so on there. So I guess the idea of going back to that little app that Barry was showing is it's a in the end we all have to make a call as to whether we use 50/50, 60/40, 70/30 in terms of dry versus wetter. And I think that looking at a variety of sites, listening to what other people are saying and so on, but then you can look at that and see how that changes it for your situation. Thanks, Bill.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, team. Thank you for all of your presentations. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment and get straight into some questions. So you should be able to see all of our speakers on screen. We've got 5 minutes left just to wrap up with a few questions, and the rest of the information we'll send round in that follow-up document. So anything coming into the chat, I'll try and work to get through, along with there's a couple which came through the registration process, but I'm happy they've been answered by the content delivered by our speakers. So Nigel, let's kick off with one for you for Emily. Emily, do you give any weight to riskiness of crops finishing with a dry spring, e.g. canola versus wheat, in addition to the ROI ranking for response to added N?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and one that I've probably been thinking about a bit more recently, probably in regards to the, I guess, coupling of a drier spring and potentially a bit more El Nino type conditions and frost, and just how we manage the risk of that. And I think that as I've sort of thought it through, I think that it's definitely one to give thought to of how we manage it. But I hope that probably it's been considered in our sowing order a bit more at this point than we're thinking about it going forward with nitrogen decisions. I think that this year, like, there was definitely a lot of people keen to say get wheat in early, and we were probably a bit cautious of that, getting it in too early and being in a high risk frost zone, or frost sort of risk area, not so much zone. I am thinking of paddock zoning as well, though. Yeah, it is one that I would give thought to, but it's probably difficult to put numbers onto. And if you are thinking of, well, I don't know if you're exactly pointing at frost, but when I'm thinking of frost, I think that ultimately we can still have devastating frosts in canola, even though it sort of has that wider flowering window, as much as we could in wheats or barleys as well. And I think the timing of it too, like we've been hit before with even late frosts that, you know, the timing of when it falls is difficult to pinpoint as well. I find it difficult probably to put numbers on it, but I think it is probably something to talk through with growers and to think of where you sort of fall with your attitude towards the risk of that decision is a good point. Does anyone have
Thanks,
anything
Emily.
else to add on that one, I guess?
Well, any of our speakers want to add anything, but I will throw to Peter as well and perhaps ask, how does frost interact with El Nino?
Really good question. We do. I mean, El Nino tends to have clearer night skies, so we tend to get higher maximum temperatures, lower minimum temperatures. El Nino tends to, and the frosts we have are radiation frost. So generally, El Nino increased frost. We would generally say that those late frosts are I mean, they're just weather events. They're sort of hard to get right. But Emily's point about just how advanced the crops are, there may be areas that are, yeah. So I think frost is a consideration here, including with the nitrogen for those paddocks, given how early things are and a slight leaning towards increased chance with drier conditions.
And I think that ultimately the take home thing, I guess, that we could be thinking of right now is how we actually manage paddocks and zoning in paddocks. And I think there's been a lot of work done. The high mid north high rainfall zones one that come to mind, and Mick Faulkner in his zoning of paddocks and thinking of the risk management in different zones of paddocks. I think that's probably what I'd go away and think about if you're thinking of nitrogen decisions and frost risk.
Thank you. Sam, I've got two for you. I'll throw them over to you and see what you can do with these. How important is it maintaining flexibility with split applications this year? And then when and at what crop stage should we apply N?
Um, yeah, I guess it's going to depend on the individual paddock scenario and probably how much starting in some of these paddocks have. Um, like if we're starting with a high background soil N, then the urgency to have N on early is not really there if we're already fed to a reasonable target. And there's enough N there to sort of get the crop up and going and tillering. Then there's the opportunity to delay that decision and allow a few more weeks of the season to pass by and I guess accumulate a bit more rainfall, hopefully, and have a bit more confidence in the decision. But if we're starting with a lower soil N, then yeah, there might be a cause to act a bit earlier. But what I will say is, in a scenario where we've got crops that are established reasonably early, from late April to early May, so cereals now are hitting the 3 to 4 leaf stage, and it's the second week of June, and you've got a high soil N, you've got limited levers to pull to actually rein your crop in, and there's a potential to grow some pretty big biomass crops here, which may not be what we want to do. We haven't had a year like this for a while, and sometimes we forget how big these crops can get. So in terms of canopy management, might be a case of actually holding back for that reason, just so that we don't push some crops too hard and end up with more bulk and more tillers than we really need to target the yield potentials that are realistic for our environment. So it's my answer is it depends on the situation, but just a few things to consider there.
Thanks, Sam. And I'll just do one last question. I'm conscious we've just hit 101, but we might have one last question for the day, and then I've got one online as well. Barry, I'll throw to you. So building on what we've been talking about, how are you balancing the temptation to chase potential against protecting profitability?
Well, to an extent, Belinda, I'm using that app to think about it. We're actually sort of slightly off, but we're pretty confident that we're going to come home okay this year, even if we have a dry spring. So we're a bit bullish. We had a very similar situation in 23, and interestingly enough, that year we had a El Nino and a positive Indian Ocean dipole, so quite a dry spring. And as Peter showed in the graphs, and the crop still came home with gusto, and we had some good results. And interestingly enough, the lentils didn't particularly share in those better results, which I guess was partly about perhaps the accessing the moisture in the profile. So yeah, so I guess we are allowed, yeah, we are putting urea out at the moment, and hopefully we do capitalize on the potential we think we're there. So but again, we're trying to balance that between the upside and the downside.
Perfect, thank you. And just over to our speakers, any final comments you'd like to share on things to think about as people move into the next phase in the season with your RiskWise hats on? Perhaps I'll go around to each of you, and then we'll call it a Friday. Emily, perhaps can I start with you?
Oh, pressure. I think probably I'd put emphasis on the information that we do know now rather than information that it's still chances of probabilities. And I think that we should remember that it has been a great start to the season. Crops are looking great. They're coming along well. It is probably a little bit nerve-wracking, some of them how quickly they're going, but we are in a good start. And I think that we should probably think of our yield estimates as a little bit pessimistically, that the spring is probably a higher chance of being drier, but we are in a good starting position. Probably just the distinction between where we've come from, where we're going forward.
Thanks, Emily. Barry.
Oh, look, it's just what I normally say. Just no expectations. Just follow process. Good agronomy pays. Just do all that stuff that we know has to be done, and just what will be will be.
Thanks, Barry. Sam.
Yeah, I don't have any real pearls of wisdom, Bill, other than we've talked around, some of the processes today in terms of what to do in specific examples. You need to go through the process with your own numbers and make those decisions. So can't do much more than that.
Thanks, Sam. And Peter, last one from you.
I guess RiskWise is about good decisions versus lucky decisions. I think a good decision here is to talk to someone about this. I think, talk it through. These are difficult. These are conflicting. We've got pros and cons and everything else. Getting some numbers down, but I think there's a real value in having conversations with a trusted advisor and trusted friends.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Righto, team. Thank you for joining with us and sticking with us throughout the day. It's been great meeting with you this Friday, the 12th of June. We're wishing you all the best in the next phase of the season, and we'll keep you posted with additional webinars if the need arrives. From our end, we will be issuing some follow-up notes and resources, and we'll email them to you on the email address that you provided in the registration form. And we'll also make this webinar available on CSIRO's RiskWise web platform. We'll include that link in the follow-up notes. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me directly and we'll see what we can chase up. But as I mentioned, we will issue some follow-up notes following today's session. So thanks very much for joining us. Take care of you all, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thanks all.